understanding what the difference between US and British English really means in day-to-day business. 10 tips. As a Brit managing executive English, I'm often asked what the differences really are between British and American English. And I can tell you that they boil down to a lot more than just fries versus chips or elevator versus lift. As Quantum Cat, our communications arm, manages more and more content for international brands, so we see American English being the chosen business language for most of our clients. But of course, a lot of our smaller German clients tend to use British English because we're in Europe. But what really are the differences? What should non-native speakers really know when it comes to the nuances between the two languages? And who better to help me discuss this than Greta Brunner, our head of customer engagement, and of course our favourite Texan. So Greta, there is an old saying that America and Britain are two nations divided by a common language. We have decided to provide our listeners with a summary of the 10 most important differences that they need to understand. Where would you start?
To be honest, Beth, I think the first one we should look at is spelling. Like you say, I think most of our clients know that we say elevator, and you Inselhafen, as the Germans call you, use the word lift. But when we write texts for our clients, some of the spellings are really critical. Take digitalization, for example. It's got that Z in it for us and an S in it for you. Organize is another one that follows that. Then there are words like consumer behavior, which in American English is spelt behavior. There's no U in it like you use. Traveled, in American English, has just one L, and another really common misspelt one that I see is focusing, which has one S in American English and two S in British English. How do you spell center?
C-E-N-T-R-E.
We spell it center, same for theater, E-R. And be careful for words like defense, license, offense. These have an S in American English and a C in British English. So my first piece of advice around tip 1 spelling is get that spell checker on.
Thanks, Greta. That's really helpful. And it brings me actually quite nicely to my tip number 2, which would be grammar. Because this is obviously something that spell checkers can't catch, right? You remember that famous campaign for Apple in the 1990s, Think Different? To a Brit, it sounded really great and seriously American. But as you know, we would say, in British English, think differently. So grammar is really important when we write. Sometimes when I do a good job, you'll say to me, "You did good, Beth," if you don't mind me taking the mickey out of your accent. But of course, I would say, "You did well." The Americans just don't use the adverbs like we do. And there's so many more examples. I'm constantly correcting my clients when they use the second conditional incorrectly, for example. If I won the lottery, I would buy a car. And of course, what I hear my German speakers say is, if I would win the lottery, I would buy. And I tell them that that's incorrect. But of course, I know that you Americans do use this form sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. But really, we shouldn't write it. We know it's bad grammar. If I would see it written, I would correct it. Oops! There I go again.
I mean, yeah, that's a classic example. You also don't use the present perfect like we do. I say, for example, I have been to a great conference recently. But you would say, I went recently, like the past tense.
Exactly.
And you would use the past tense when the Brits would use the present perfect. And we're quite strict on the present perfect, like with recently, since, for, never, ever, yet, already. We always use the present perfect.
Yeah, that's true. We don't. I might say I did it already, not I have done it already. But again, it's totally colloquial. If I were writing it formally, I would use it in the correct form, which is the British English model. But there are examples where both can work. For example, you might say to me, "It's April, isn't it?" And I would probably say to you, "It's April, right?" We don't use tag questions as much as you do either. But to be honest, neither one is right or wrong. It's kind of more of a style thing. Like, think of advertising. You might see a slogan in both British and American English that would say, "You're working too many hours, right? Buy our software and knock 2 hours off your day." This sounds punchier than, "You're working too many hours, aren't you?"
Now that's a good point, because it actually brings me to tip 3, which is style and register. I think, generally speaking, the Americans say and write things more simply. I love that expression in German, which is blumig, meaning flowery. But I think our language in British English tends to be more convoluted, meaning complex. It is more flowery. And I think we use more academic or poetic English on a day-to-day basis. So in business English, in a world where it is a skill to be simple, I would say that the American English, for me, is a fresher choice here. And as a writer, I definitely prefer the American style of being clear, simple, and easy to understand. And that brings me to tip 4, which is closely related to what I just said. The Americans, I think, are more direct and less formal.
Definitely.
In British English, we even are more polite, and of course that manifests itself in what is written because we tend to use indirect language in order to be polite. But there is a major thing about American English that I think contradicts this. I think you guys just love your empty buzzwords. Sometimes you guys can say so much, and actually when you look at the content, there's just no meaning behind it.
Hell yeah, we love our marketing BS. And actually, as this podcast is about practical tips, I would say that when we use American English, we do use a lot more phrases, idioms, buzzwords, and jargon. And we don't feel the need to explain what they mean. I think in British English, there's a more emotional tone in the language, the need to explain to a client or a customer what the benefits will be to them personally. We just throw efficiency, agility, speed, whatever out there. This is another reason why it can be easier and punchier to use American English.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I think obviously we do use the phrase efficiency, but really if we're trying to convince somebody, we'd say you'll be able to manage your office better. We'd speak to the personal and emotional behind the message and not throw out an empty, meaningless buzzword. But let's look at some more obvious differences now, because this brings me to tip 5. Let's look at the nouns that we use in business, because I said at the beginning of this podcast, obviously, there are a lot of differences, elevator, lift, for example, but, I think there's a lot more than that and some important business ones as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. Let me think. Well, obviously, the one that jumps to mind is soccer versus football, which actually can be a little confusing to me, especially when making small talk here in Germany. Bathroom versus the British toilet is another one that comes up in small talk, and I cannot stand it. It's too blunt for us. The British toilet, as well as pants versus the British trousers. For you guys, it means something a little bit different, doesn't it?
That's right. I would fall about laughing if a guy came into a business meeting and asked me if I liked his new pants. Not that he'd say that, but yeah.
Right? Yeah, we use mad to mean something exciting, and you guys mean mad as in crazy.
Yeah.
We use smart to mean intelligent. You guys use smart to mean less casual. But when I think of words that have different meanings totally, that we use more in business English, then I think of attorney, where you guys use lawyer, or bespoke, and we just don't use that at all. We use custom made. You say canteen, we say cafeteria. We talk about college graduates, not university graduates. And of course, we say cell instead of mobile, and you guys say CV and not resume.
Wow, there's a lot of those. You're quite right. So tell me about being politically correct, because this is the tip that I wanted to bring in for number 6. I have to say that none of the experts can agree on whether the Brits or the Americans are more politically correct. I would certainly say chairperson. What would you say?
Honestly, I would say chairman, even for a woman.
You see, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And there was a recent survey conducted by the Pew Research Centre, RE, that's a joke, to see if there was any reaction to Trump's less PC politics. And it found that 67% of Britons think that too many people are offended by language unnecessarily, and only 59% of Americans thought that. But I do know that you guys are very sensitive. Like, if you look at holiday season greetings, for example, you would never write Happy Christmas, right?
No, definitely not. We would always write Happy Holidays, so as to acknowledge non-Christian communities.
Yeah. And I think that being PC is something that you have to have in your head when you use either American or British English. It's quite important. It's subtle, I grant you that, but it's important. Let's move on to tip number 7, which is idiomatic language. How about I shout out some British English idioms and you shout out the corresponding ones in US English?
Sure.
So if I don't trust you, I would say I would not touch you with a barge pole.
I wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. And to ignore something, I would say to sweep it under the carpet.
No, sweep it under the rug.
And to have a secret past, I might say I've got a skeleton in the cupboard.
A skeleton in the closet.
And a drop in the ocean.
A drop in the bucket. That means to have a tiny impact, by the way.
And to big yourself up or blow one's own trumpet.
Blow one's own horn.
So you see, these are all very different. So again, when we're writing in English, we need to be careful even with the idiomatic language you use. Which brings me to tip 8. And actually this is a little bit drier, so we'll try and get through this quite quickly. It's punctuation. So there's quite a lot of difference in punctuation, Greta.
Yeah, I would write, for example, that I'm Miss Bruner, MS. Bruner. You would write your MRS without a dot, correct?
Correct. Although, you see, I would have said point there and not dot. That's another difference between British and American English. But yeah, I would write Mrs. without the dot or the point, and you'd write Ms. with.
Yeah, correct.
And another thing that really gets me when I write American English, which is often, is that with quotation marks, you put the full stop before them at the end of the sentence, and we put them after.
Yeah, that's right.
And you would write, like, the 1980s with an apostrophe.
Yes, absolutely. What do you mean, you don't?
No, we don't, you see. We admit it.
Oh, okay. I just learned another thing.
Well, that kind of brings me to talking about time in British versus in American English, which is tip 9. Because we would say 10:15, and you'd say 10:15, right?
Yeah, that's right. And we would write it 10:15. But you guys would write it with a dot, wouldn't you?
Yeah, we would. So we'd write 10:15. And do you use 24-hour clock?
Oh, no. Military time? Not typically.
No, we don't either. So we would write 10 p.m. like you, not 2200 like the Germans would. But we do it differently, I think, when it comes to days and months. For example, today is the 5th of April 2018, and I would write the 5th.4.18.
And I would write 4/5/18. And we would say it differently too. We would say April 5th, 2018 with April 1st.
Yeah, okay. That's not easy for non-native speakers, right? That could get seriously confusing. Well, let's end with our final tip 10, which is accent. You pronounce a lot of words differently to us. And this is less of a problem, of course, when we're writing, but it can be an issue when we're understanding and when we're speaking. So let me shout out a few typical business ones, and then you can be my echo.
Let's go.
Route.
Route.
Privacy.
Privacy.
Schedule.
Schedule.
Mobile.
Mobile.
Advertisement.
Advertisement.
Globalization.
Globalization.
Brochure.
Brochure.
And how do you say that's the end of this podcast?
That's the end of this podcast.